Let's talk about the Labour Party. Upcoming British election on the 4th of July. The Labour Manifesto, it's very underwhelming. What this has been described as, and maybe a bit misquoted, is what's called a conspiracy of silence. There are large parts of the budgets that are just not addressed. And there are also goals that don't really align with the amount that they're willing to spend on it. So the problem there is, before we get into the manifesto, because it's going to be relevant, I want to talk about just like the history of the party, first of all. So, the United Kingdom Labour Party was formed in about the year 1900, I think February 1900. They were formed out of a collection of sort of trade unions and socialists and Marxists. They were a very left-wing group, and they decided to form an actual political party to run in elections in about 1900. It takes a while for them to get any kind of decent results, though. They start in 1900 with the leader, famous Keir Hardie, who wins 40,000 votes, just over, 1.3%. He doesn't do very well. The main parties at this time are the Conservatives and the Liberals. These are the main parties. You move on, 1906, Labour Party still just kind of like building up. They're at 7% by 1910. 6.4, still struggling. There's Mr. Balfour. And it's only by 1922 when they get to form under Ramsay MacDonald, without even getting the most votes or the most seats, is they manage to form a minority government alongside with some kind of like tacit support from the Liberals. And then they lose it immediately afterwards, like very close afterwards. So they have a bit of an uphill struggle. And if you're wondering, so Labour's formed in 1900. Now the year's 2024. In that time, you know how many prime ministers the Labour Party have produced in all that time? 6. They've produced 6. Which means in this government, since 2010, the last 14 years, it's just won over the amount of prime ministers that the Conservatives have produced just in this government, just in this string of terms since 2010. The Conservatives have produced 5, right? They've had David Cameron, they went through Theresa May, they went through Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak. And if you even group up the amount of time they've been in, Labour doesn't even become the main opposition until the 1920s. So since they were formed in the last 120 years, they have held office for about 30 of those years. 30 of 120 years. The United Kingdom is a country for the Conservative Party. Like, it is generally in their favor, whether it's not just the constituencies or the popular vote. Sometimes, occasionally, the Conservatives will win most of the seats without the popular vote, but usually they get both. They get majority of seats and they get the popular vote, usually, because more people want to put them in power. So for the Labour Party, puts them in a difficult position because they started out as a very, very radical party with a radical platform. If you look at one of their first pictures, it's for public ownership, not private property, vote Labour. Your industry must serve the people, not enslave them. One of their foundations was this goal, not just for social democratic reforms, it was to socialize the means of production. They were a socialist party. But because the argument in the UK to this day has not really been won on socialism, it hasn't even really been won on social democracy. Like, not in the same way it has been for, say, like Scandinavia. So that puts Labour under a lot of pressure. And as a result, they've more or less been veering on the right side of the party since they were formed. Even in their first big victory, the first time they ever won a majority, which was 1945, Clement Attlee was considered the right wing of the Labour Party, okay? But obviously, compared to today, his platform was very, very, very radical. It included, what did it include? Oh yeah, because he joined NATO, yeah. It included the birth of the NHS, the National Health Service. It included nationalisation of railways, of coal. It expanded national insurance. He expanded welfare. He did like a very, very radical set of reforms. He massively expanded the construction of council houses, and a lot of these things stayed. A lot of these things stay to this day. The NHS still exists. It's still our health service. He oversaw a lot of decolonization as well. The British mandate of Palestine ended under Attlee, as did the British rule over India. But even here, he doesn't last very long. He is booted out by Churchill in 1951. And then you go through the 70s, where you've got like labor rule under people like Harold Wilson. And then I think the last one was, what do you call it? Who's the other guy? James Callaghan. And then when Thatcher wins, Labour goes through a massive existential crisis because they get annihilated in every election they have after, like, under Thatcher and even John Major. And Thatcher obviously undoes a lot of the kind of like consensus that was built up around Labour. She's very much against public ownership of things like railway. Like, she brings the railways into private ownership. She brings the coal industry and steel industry and all that into private ownership. And most of it just gets destroyed through offshoring. Trade unions are massively weakened. It used to be something like 3/4 of people in the UK were in unions. Now it's like a quarter, maybe a bit less, give or take. So yeah, there are pretty radical changes. And then Labour has to suddenly make a decision where they decide to move eventually, after suffering pretty horrible defeats at the hands of Thatcher and Major, is they move right again, and you have Tony Blair. And then suddenly these ideas like Clause 4 and the idea of socializing the means of production and things like that, they get kind of ditched. So I think if you look at it as a general trajectory, I think it's fair to say that Labour's way of being, because they're actually like a Labour Party. They're not like the difference between a Labour Party and, say, the Democratic Party is that a Labour Party is largely union backed. Usually, I think it's about half of Labour's funding comes straight from trade unions. At different stages, I think under Corbyn, it was like 90%. So yeah, they're a very union-backed party. Like, they're a Labour party. They're not a liberal centre party. They're a Labour party. But balancing that with trying to come into power, you've had trade unions moving a bit more to the right, and then also the party itself. Keir Starmer, Mr. Keith, is no exception. Not really. So the Labour Manifesto, to give you a breakdown of it, it's very underwhelming. And this whole pressure to not appear too far left wing has probably exemplified itself in Keir Starmer more than anyone else, actually. Probably even more so than Blair. Because obviously in 2019, Labour ran with Jeremy Corbyn, a historically very left-wing leader, even actually by historical standards of the Labour Party, and he got absolutely trounced by Boris Johnson in 2019. He put forward a very, very left-wing progressive manifesto, probably one of the most left-wing manifestos even just like in Europe, let alone in the UK. And the Conservatives bag the best majority they've had since the 30s, since like 35, I think. So Keir has tasked himself with his top priority being, don't be like Corbyn. Don't be like Corbyn. And this has meant dropping people from the party or from the shadow cabinet for insanely trivial reasons sometimes. It's, for example, Rebecca Long-Bailey shared this article that was all about why people should still vote left why they should still vote Labour if they're left wing. But I think the article had one sentence in it buried in it, like alluding to this weird conspiracy theory that Derek Chauvin learned kneeling on people's necks, George Floyd, from the IDF, from IDF training courses. So obviously, amidst the associations of Corbyn or anyone associated with Corbyn and anti-Semitism, Keir dropped her. He just dropped her like that, and that is going to stain her career for the next fucking 20 or 30 years. He has gotten rid of people for going to help striking unions, for showing up at strikes with unions, even though unions back the Labour Party. He had a strict rule against doing that. So his first principle, Keir Starmer, is to not look like Corbyn. And he has distanced himself very, very, very effectively from that. Long Bailey is still running for Labour. Yeah, I know she is, but she's not in the shadow cabinet anymore, right? Like, all the traces of Corbynism is basically gone from Starmer's inner circle. That's been his first priority. And incidentally, It's worked. It's worked actually very well because Keir Starmer is doing pretty well in the polls right now. He's set to win probably the biggest Labour majority ever. Like, it might even be bigger than Attlee's or Blair's, right? At one point, he had 50 points against the Conservatives' 19. So not only is he doing quite well in the polls, by the way, in the UK, you can get a pretty strong majority with like 33 or 32% of the vote. Like, you don't need that much. Not only is he doing quite well, but also the Conservative Party is doing horribly, historically horribly, to the point that they're getting matched by a completely new party, Reform UK. So they're in a very advantageous position, which gives them quite a lot of leeway, really, to be fairly ambitious, you would think. No, not this manifesto. This manifesto is about as tepid and inoffensive, or attempted to be inoffensive, as basically everything Keir Starmer has done. From the very outset, he basically rules out three very big things. One is no increases of taxes, like main forms of taxes, like VAT or income tax, things like that. He's also ruled out borrowing, or at least borrowing beyond what the fiscal rules are set by this government, by the Conservatives. And he's also ruled out austerity, cuts to public services. Now, there's a problem there, because if you want to do anything cool with a government budget, you have to either cut money from somewhere that you don't think is producing anything useful, so something you think is wasteful or something that could be better spent elsewhere, or more conventionally, you raise taxes or you increase borrowing. The problem is, everyone remembers 2008, and everyone blamed 2008 in the UK on borrowing. So borrowing is massively stigmatized. It's especially stigmatized for Labour, because Labour they were the party in power when 2008 happened. Raising taxes is very dirty to do in a manifesto, or very taboo, because the problem with the British public is they typically agree with the principle that you should raise taxes to fund public services. But then when it comes to an election, they vote against it. So people are very hesitant to vote for a party that is going to increase their taxes. So the result is that whatever Labour is offering here, it is very, very anemic. Even though there are some things here that are fairly, they're a step up from Conservatives, it's very anemic. So one of them, for example, is they're going to nationalise the railways. Now, when they say the railways, they mean the rail companies, not the companies that own the trains. That's different. The companies that take leases on the trains and charge people fares. They're going to nationalize that, which will mean, people won't be able to adjust prices in the same way that they do, in a way that private companies do, that is like extra beneficial to them, and costs will probably come down. The problem with that, though, is it's kind of just continuing a trend that's already been in place. Conservatives have been nationalizing rail companies right, left, and center for years now. Because what will happen is the private companies will fail in their obligations, and the Conservatives will nationalize it. I think about a quarter of the trains in England now are run by the government. Like, they're not run by private companies. So they're all, even that, as much as it seems like a good step forward, like a sharp left turn, it's not even really. It's just continuing something that's logically going to happen anyway. It's going to happen much quicker than the Conservatives would do it, but it is happening. Another thing would be his proposals for the NHS. They're talking about pretty ambitious goals for the NHS, large numbers of new staff. They're talking about increasing the number of appointments by 40,000 per week. They're talking about trying to increase the mental health workforce. They're talking about things there. The problem is the amount of money they're pledging, which is like an extra $2 billion a year after 2028 or something like that. For context, the NHS, the health and social care budget in the UK, or even just in England, is 192 billion. So adding 2 billion to that, compared to the Conservatives, who are increasing it by 1 billion. It's like peanuts. And this is the same with quite a lot of their policies as well. For education, they're talking about raising money through taxing people. But again, the problem with raising taxes is that raising taxes, finding ways to tax the rich isn't actually a very effective way to pay for services. You have to be willing to tax like at least the kind of like 5%, like the top 5%. You can't just go for like the very, very niche areas to tax because either they have ways of avoiding it or it just doesn't get you as much as you think it does. So for education, his big thing is that he's going to start taxing VAT on private schools and getting rid of their business rate reliefs. So that'll be taxing private schools more, like private school fees. And the thing that's going to pay for will be like free breakfast clubs in every primary school. It doesn't raise that much money, but free breakfast clubs. So that's something I love because I think probably one of the biggest predictors for social spending on education to increase results is breakfast, like kids being fed. It's like one of the best guarantor of results for primary education. But it's all small things though. Again, it's just small problems with. They're talking about money for a national wealth fund, but again, it's only like I think it's like 7 billion over 5 years. It's not that much, and it's quite scattered as well. So things that you'd actually see like a huge tangible result in, I don't really know. The one thing that does have quite a big number next to it is for green initiatives, which is got about 24 billion. And this is aiming to create like over 500,000 jobs by 2030. This is talking about trying to achieve net zero in a fairly quick space of time. Trying to make sure that renewables outpace fossil fuels really quickly. This is quite innovative and quite ambitious, but also it's leading you to another problem where most of this money is going to be borrowed, and because this brings you into something that's maybe a bit more worrying about Labour's manifesto. Because Labour have said that they're going to stick to the same fiscal rules as the Conservatives, that also means that they're going to not borrow any more than the current government will. But it also means that they're going to stick more or less to the Conservatives' current spending plans. And the problem is that the current spending plans involve cuts. So you have two problems. One, they're not going to actually borrow that much, Labour. And a lot of what they are saying they want to do, like for the NHS, is probably not going to get paid for unless they borrow. And for the more unprotected services, say like courts or prisons and things like that, there's actually nothing in this manifesto that says what they're going to do to it. So they're in a bit, and what this has been described as, and maybe a bit misquoted, is what's called a conspiracy of silence. And it's a thing across most of these manifestos, is that there are large parts of the budgets that are just not addressed. And there are also goals that don't really align with the amount that they're willing to spend on it. So the problem there is it usually means that they're going to either have to pay for it with taxes, which they said they wouldn't, or with borrowing, which they said they wouldn't, or with cuts, which they said they wouldn't. We just have to guess. We have to guess which one they're going to do once they've got the mandate from the people, which is a bit cringe. Otherwise, just things like, again, things that are better than what we have now, but just, in my opinion, not good enough. You've got like housing, where they're saying that they're doing the classic thing where they say they want to build 300,000 homes per year. The problem is that governments rarely ever meet their goals for housing. The previous government missed it massively. The only time I think in the last 30 years when a government has met their goals for housing was in like 2004 under Labour, when the goal was 200,000. They beat their goal for 2 years for building houses. And they did that because of quite a lot of economic growth. But again, there's nothing here about how they're going to pay for getting up to 300,000. They haven't even suggested that much in terms of council housing, because the times when we were able to get 300,000 homes a year was way back in like 1960s and 70s. And the way we got those numbers was because like half of the building was done by the state. It was council houses or by community funds. But Labour don't have a plan for that. They're just saying that they're going to do this by getting rid of red tape and by simplifying housing laws. So like it just sounds like there's a kind of like a secret button that only they know about. But yeah, I don't know. I'd be very surprised. They're not going to get 300,000 houses a year. I would almost bet. I would bet quite a lot on that. Yeah. On a slightly brighter side, they want to immediately scrap the Tories' Rwanda plan, this idea of trying to deport illegal migrants to Rwanda, an insanely expensive policy that runs into massive legal blocks, not only in the European Union or the European Court of Human Rights, but also locally. For the first flight that they tried to do this with, that ultimately never took off, this policy was blocked ultimately by the UK Supreme Court because Rwanda was not considered safe enough to do this, to send them over there. Good thing the Labour Party are getting rid of that. Very, very good. As far as their strategy, though, when it comes to spending overall, it seems to be that their only way forward, potentially, with doing this, with like their plan, is that they might be able to pay for the things that they want to do with economic growth. And that seems to be their strategy. They're very much pursuing something that they call securonomics, which has kind of been happening across European countries and also actually by the Biden administration as well. It's this idea of using state money to direct where investment goes in particular industries and to prop up certain industries, but without fully nationalizing them. And the reason they're talking about doing that, especially with energy, is because of most prominently, the recent shock of the Russia-Ukraine war. Countries don't want to be dependent on Russian oil and gas to a point where they're going to suffer a massive inflation crisis if there's a war. And they're also doing it in response to Chinese practices as well. They're like inflation of the fucking yuan or whatever. Yeah. Like this is the idea of like this kind of protectionist, kind of state interventionist policy. The problem again with it is they've done something. They've got that, I can't remember what they've called it, but they're going to start up a new national energy fund that's just like, it's not nationalizing energy. It's not that, but it's a fund that will direct money towards different green projects. Yeah, Great British Energy, yeah. So they're going to make this fund that will allocate funding to direct like what kind of parts of the green economy that they want to boost, which is not too different from what Biden's been doing. The difference is, again, though, is that the Democratic Party, incidentally, spent a lot more on this. They were so much more ambitious, even proportionately compared to the population and GDP than Labour are being, because the American one was massively deficit financed or debt financed. It was based on borrowing, which Labour are less open about doing. So that is more or less the Labour Manifesto. It's quite a few very needed improvements, but ultimately just kind of underwhelming, honestly. I don't know if Starmer is doing this because he wants to keep this majority. I don't know if that's just because ideologically that's where he is. I'm maybe not inclined to believe he's a very ideologically driven person just because of the fact that he was fairly supportive of Labour when Corbyn was there. But I don't know. It could also just be that he's willing to do this to get elected and then will do something like borrowing or raising taxes when he's in because it will result in things that make him more popular. I have no idea. No idea. He's definitely going to win though. So there is that. And he's definitely going to win with a majority so big that I don't think any smaller party is going to be able to put any pressure on them. If they had a smaller majority than this, if it goes down to like 29, 28, then maybe a Labour-Liberal coalition would mean the Liberals can push them further left. Greens won't do it. Greens don't have enough to get enough seats. But it looks like Labour are going to have a pretty large majority, and it's going to be really to push them further. It's going to be up to unions who back them to pressure them left, or just people joining and doing it from within. That's how I think it's going to go anyway. I'm not going to vote for them because I'm Scottish. Don't need them here. But yeah, that looks like where it's going to go. There are a few more detailed problems with the Labour Manifesto, but it's common to basically all of them. So I'm going to talk about that in a different segment. We'll do a different segment on what we call costed manifestos, quotation mark. And the other concept will be conspiracy of silence, the way governments, the way parties like Labour and the Conservatives especially are hiding the dirt from their manifestos. But we'll do that later. That's the Labour Party. Hopefully that influences your decision on whether or not you want to vote for them. Or it doesn't, because you're probably American. I don't care. Fuck you, dick. Get out. Okay, nice. Good segment. Well done. Well done, chat.